They're going to burn it down. Tonight. Those 6 words came out of a 12-year-old girl's mouth in a dark alley, and the man she said them to was the president of the Hells Angels. She had no phone, no lawyer, no adult in her corner. She had a crumpled dollar bill, a note written on a grocery receipt, and a grandmother whose house was going to be ash by morning if nobody moved. So Ellie moved. She walked straight into the most dangerous territory in 3 counties, and she taped everything she had left to a stranger's motorcycle. And she changed both their lives forever. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me all the way to the end of this story, because I promise you, it only gets more powerful from here. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The dollar bill was soft from being folded and unfolded too many times. Ellie knew because she had folded it herself. Once the night her mother left, once the morning her grandmother cried at the kitchen table, once the afternoon she sat behind the gas station dumpster trying to count the cost of everything that was going wrong in her life and came up exactly $1 short of any real answer. She was 12 years old. She weighed about as much as a wet coat, and she had been standing in that alley for 47 minutes, watching the Iron Horse Diner through a crack between 2 buildings, trying to decide if she was brave enough or just desperate enough to do what she was thinking about doing. There is a difference between those 2 things. Brave means you have a choice and you walk toward the hard thing anyway. Desperate means the hard thing is the only thing left. Ellie was desperate. She pressed the back of her hand against her lips and stared at the row of motorcycles parked along the curb in front of the diner. Big machines, all of them. Black and chrome and loud-looking, even when they were sitting still. She had seen them roll into town that morning, heard them before she saw them, that low thunder that rolls through the ground before it fills the air. 11 bikes, maybe 12, and every single one of them belonged to a Hells Angel. She knew the patch. Everybody in that town knew the patch. The death's head on the back of a leather vest was the kind of image that stayed with you once you saw it. Kids at school whispered about them the way they whispered about things that were half legend, half real. Her teacher, Mr. Donnelly, once told the class that the Hells Angels were not something to romanticize, not something to get close to, not something to joke about. Ellie wasn't joking. She wasn't romanticizing either. She was standing in an alley with a crumpled dollar, a piece of tape she had found stuck to the bottom of her sneaker, and a note she had written on the back of a grocery receipt, the only paper she'd had on her. The note said, "Please help us. They're going to burn my grandma's house. I don't have anything but this dollar. It's everything I have." She had almost written, "I'm sorry, it's only $1. But then she thought that sounded like she was apologizing for existing, and she was so tired of doing that, so she left it the way it was. Now she was standing here, and the question was simple, even if the answer wasn't. Which bike? She didn't know any of their names. She didn't know who was in charge. She didn't know if there was a rule about touching their motorcycles, though she assumed there probably was, and she assumed breaking that rule probably had consequences she didn't want to think about. But she also knew that in 48 hours, maybe less, Vance Hooper was going to burn her grandmother's house to the ground. She had heard him say it herself. 3 weeks earlier, life had been bad, but manageable. That was the word Ellie used in her head, manageable. It was a grown-up word, and she had grown up fast enough to use it honestly. Her grandmother Ruth was 71 years old with bad knees and a good heart and a stubbornness that had gotten her through 60 years of everything life had thrown at her. She had raised Ellie's mother in that house. She had raised Ellie in that house for the past 4 years, ever since Ellie's mother had made a set of choices that meant she was no longer someone Ellie could count on. Ruth didn't talk about those choices. She just opened the door wider and set another plate at the table and said, "Well, you're here now, and here is where you'll stay." The house was small, and it was old, and it needed things. The porch boards creaked like they were always on the edge of giving way. The water heater complained every morning. The roof had a soft spot over the back bedroom that Ellie was careful not to think about too hard during rainstorms. But it was theirs. Ruth had paid for it in pieces over 32 years. A little here, a little there, through work and sacrifice and the kind of patience that most people don't have the stamina for anymore. It was hers. It was home. Vance Hooper had moved into the property beside theirs about 8 months ago. At first, he was just a presence. A truck in the driveway, lights on late at night, a voice on the phone that carried through walls. Then he started looking at Ruth's house differently. Not the way a neighbor looks at a neighbor's house, the way a man looks at something he has already decided to take. He came over one afternoon in October with papers. Ellie had been sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when Ruth opened the door. She hadn't moved from her chair, but she had listened to every word. Hooper told Ruth that he had done some research, that he had found documentation, old documentation, he was careful to say, as if age made it more legitimate, suggesting that the property line had been incorrectly drawn years ago. That, according to his research, a significant portion of Ruth's land, including the section where the house itself sat, technically and legally belonged to the adjacent lot. His lot. Ruth had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Hooper, I have lived in this house for 32 years. "Yes, ma'am," Hooper said, and his voice was smooth in the way that glass is smooth. Hard underneath, gives you no grip. "And that's a real shame. But the law doesn't care how long you've been somewhere. The law cares about the paper." "I have paper too," Ruth said. "I know you do, and I've had mine looked at by an attorney. I think, if you're smart about this, you'll want to avoid the legal process. It gets expensive. And at your age," he paused. Let the silence do the work he didn't want to dirty his hands with. "At your age, I imagine you'd want this resolved quietly." Ruth had closed the door, but Hooper didn't go away. He sent letters. He sent men with clipboards who stood on the sidewalk and took photographs of the house and wrote things down. He called the county office and filed what he called a preliminary claim review, which meant exactly nothing in legal terms, but sounded official enough to terrify someone who didn't have a lawyer and couldn't afford one. And then 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday night that had started out so ordinary that Ellie had been annoyed about having to wash dishes, she had been standing at the sink when she heard voices outside the back window. Hooper's voice, and another one she didn't recognize. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She had just gone very still, the way animals go still when they sense something is wrong. "The old woman won't move," Hooper was saying. "She's digging in." The other voice said something Ellie couldn't make out. "She doesn't have to like it," Hooper said. "She just has to leave. And if she won't leave on her own..." A pause. A sound like a hand being brushed against denim. "Then the house leaves first. You understand what I'm saying? Property that doesn't exist anymore isn't worth fighting over." Ellie had stood at that sink for a long time after the voices went away. She had not told her grandmother what she heard, because Ruth had a heart that had already been through enough, and because Ellie had already decided, in the way that 12-year-olds sometimes decide things with a clarity that adults lose, that she was not going to let this happen. She just didn't know yet what she was going to do about it. The library closed at 5. The librarian, Miss Patton, had let Ellie use the computer for 2 days in a row without asking too many questions, which Ellie was grateful for. She had looked up lawyers. She had looked up tenant rights. She had looked up property disputes and what to do when someone threatens to destroy your home. Most of what she found required money, or time, or both. They had neither. She had thought about the police. She had thought about it for a long time, sitting on the edge of her grandmother's bed while Ruth slept, listening to the thin, even sound of her breathing, thinking about what it would mean to call someone. But she had seen how the police had handled things in their neighborhood before, how long things took, how much paperwork, how many times a person could say, "He threatened us," and have someone nod seriously and write it down and do absolutely nothing about it. And Hooper was careful. He had not made his threat in writing. He had not said it to Ruth's face. He had said it to another man, outside a window, not knowing a 12-year-old girl was on the other side of the glass, with soap suds on her hands and rage building in her chest. There was no proof, and without proof, there was no protection. She had lain on her side that night and stared at the wall and thought, then I have to find something that doesn't need proof, something that moves faster than a lawsuit, something Vance Hooper is actually afraid of. She had almost laughed at herself then, because the only thing she could think of was the sound she had heard that morning, that low, rolling thunder, and the 11 motorcycles parked outside the Iron Horse Diner. The thing about fear is that it changes depending on what you're comparing it to. Ellie was afraid of the Hells Angels. Of course she was. She would have had to be stupid not to be. But she was more afraid of waking up one morning and finding that her grandmother's house was ash, and that the old woman with bad knees and a stubborn heart was sitting in the street with nowhere to go, because Ellie had been too scared to do the only thing that might have worked. That comparison was what got her moving. She stepped out of the alley. The afternoon sun hit her face and she blinked, and for a second she just stood on the sidewalk breathing, letting herself be visible, which felt reckless and terrifying and necessary all at once. She walked toward the motorcycles. Her sneakers were quiet on the pavement. The diner windows were big, and through them she could see figures, large ones, most of them, some of them in leather, talking and laughing in that low, private way that groups have when they've known each other a long time. She kept her eyes on the nearest bike. It was a big machine, black tank, lots of chrome, the kind of bike that looked like it had been built to cover distance, not the showy kind, the serious kind. There was a leather saddlebag strapped to the back, stickers on the tank that she didn't read. She stopped in front of it. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and took a breath. "You're not brave," she told herself. "You don't have to be brave. You just have to do this." She took out the note. She took out the dollar. She pressed them together against the chrome of the handlebars and pinched the tape over the corner and smoothed it down with her thumb. It looked ridiculous. A crumpled grocery receipt and a soft dollar bill taped to a machine that probably cost more than her grandmother's house. She almost pulled it off. Her fingers were already reaching for the edge of the tape when she stopped herself. Leave it, she thought. Just leave it and go. She turned around. She walked back to the alley. She sat down against the wall with her knees pulled to her chest and her heart slamming in her ribcage. And she waited. Inside the Iron Horse Diner, the coffee was bad and the pie was good, and the conversation had been going on for 3 hours, which was exactly how Bear liked it. Bear, whose full name was Robert Eugene Calloway, though nobody had called him that since his mother, and his mother had been gone for 11 years, was 44 years old, 6'3", and built like someone had assembled him out of spare parts from heavier machinery. He had a beard that had gone more gray than black in the last few years, a scar above his left eyebrow from a night in Bakersfield that he didn't like to talk about, and a laugh that people 3 tables over could hear without trying. He was the president of this chapter, had been for 9 years. And the thing about being president of anything, he had learned, was that it meant you carried what everybody else was feeling before they felt it themselves. Right now he was feeling fine. Good road behind them, good road ahead. Brothers he trusted, coffee that was bad enough to complain about pleasurably, and a slice of apple pie with crust so thick it could double as a building material. He was mid-sentence, something about the stretch of highway they'd hit outside of Marysville, when Rook came back in through the front door. Rook was 23, the youngest patched member of the chapter, and he had a face that showed everything he was thinking the way a screen door shows what's on the other side. Right now, what was on the other side was confusion, and something that Bear, in his experience, would have to describe as unsettled. "You're not smoking," Bear said. Rook had gone outside for a cigarette 15 minutes ago. "No," Rook said. He was holding something in his hand. "Found this on Duke's bike." He set it on the table. Bear looked at it, a crumpled piece of paper. a dollar bill, tape residue on one corner. The table got quieter. Not all at once. It rippled outward, the way silence does when something unexpected drops into the middle of a group. Tin, who was sitting across from Bear, leaned forward. "What is that?" "Note," Rook said. "On Duke's bike, taped to the handlebars." "Who tapes something to a Hell's Angels bike?" said a man called Garrett, with a tone that made it sound like a genuine question about human psychology. Bear picked up the paper. He unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that looks fragile. The handwriting was small and slightly uneven, the kind of handwriting that suggests the hand holding the pen was under pressure. The physical kind and the other kind. He read it once, then he read it again. The table had gone quiet enough to hear the cook moving around in the kitchen. "Kid's handwriting," Bear said. "Yeah," said Rook. "Please help us," Bear read, not loud, just to himself, tracking the words. "They're going to burn my grandma's house. I don't have anything but this dollar. It's everything I have." He set the note down flat on the table. For about 4 seconds, nobody said anything. Then Garrett said, "It could be a setup." "It's not a setup," said Tin. "You don't know that." Garrett, Bear's voice was even, quiet. He tapped the edge of the note with one finger. "What kind of setup starts with a dollar and handwriting that looks like this?" Garrett looked at the note again. He didn't say anything else. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to be this scared," Bear said. He looked around the table, at men he had ridden with for years, some of them a decade, some of them longer. Men who had seen things, done things, and still, he knew this about all of them, still had a line inside them between what was acceptable and what wasn't. A line that moved sometimes, a line that bent, but a line that didn't disappear. "Rook," Bear said, "you see anybody near the bikes when you went out?" Rook shook his head slowly. Then he stopped. "There's an alley, across the street, one building over. I thought I saw—" He paused. "I thought I saw someone sitting down in it, small. I didn't think anything of it." Bear was already standing up. He dropped 2 20s on the table for the check, which was more than it cost, and he didn't wait for change. "Let's go," he said. Ellie heard them before she saw them. Not the motorcycles this time, just footsteps. Several of them. Heavy, deliberate, the kind that belonged to people who were not in a hurry because they didn't need to be. She pressed her back against the alley wall and told herself to stay still, that she could still talk her way out of this if she needed to, that she had done nothing wrong. Her body did not believe any of that. The footsteps stopped at the entrance to the alley, and then a voice said, not loudly, not roughly, but clearly, "Hey." She looked up. Bear was standing at the mouth of the alley. Not all of them, just him, and Rook just behind his left shoulder. But Bear alone took up what felt like a significant portion of the available space. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't expected. Not anger, not amusement, something quieter than both of those things. "This yours?" he said. He was holding up the note and the dollar. Ellie's throat was so tight she wasn't sure she could speak. She nodded. Bear took one step into the alley. Just one. Stopped. Giving her space, she realized later, in the way that someone gives a frightened animal space. Not because they're afraid of it, but because they understand that fear has its own physics. "You want to tell me about it?" he said. And something about the way he said it, not a command, not a kindness exactly, but a realness, a steadiness, made Ellie's eyes fill up with tears that she absolutely did not want to shed. She pressed her fists against her knees and lifted her chin. "His name is Vance Hooper," she said, "and he is going to burn my grandmother's house down." Bear was very still for a moment. "How old are you?" he said. 12. Another beat of quiet. "How long has this been going on?" 3 weeks since I heard him say it. 8 months since he started. Bear looked back at Rook. Something passed between them. Not a word, not even a gesture. Just the kind of communication that years of riding together builds into people. and then Bear looked back at her. "What's your name?" "Ellie. Ellie." He said it once, like he was setting it somewhere he'd remember it. He held out the dollar bill flat on his palm toward her. "You taped this to Duke's bike. That's an interesting choice." "I didn't know whose bike it was," she said. "I just needed someone to notice." Something shifted in his face. Not softened exactly, more like it located something it had been looking for. "Well," Bear said, "we noticed." He looked at the dollar in his palm. He closed his fingers around it slowly. "You hired us," he said. His voice was low, and it was serious, and there was not a trace of mockery in it. "You understand what that means? That dollar? That means you're the boss. You tell us what you need. We do what we do. That's the arrangement." Ellie stared at him. "I only have $1, she said. "You had enough," Bear said, and he meant it. Bear didn't rush her. That was the thing Ellie would remember later, when she tried to put the pieces of that afternoon back in order. That he didn't rush her, didn't press her, didn't do any of the things she had braced herself for. He just crouched down in that alley, this enormous man with a gray-streaked beard and a leather vest that had seen more road than she had years of life, and he waited for her to find the words at her own speed. Rook stayed by the alley entrance. She could feel him back there, not watching her exactly, more like keeping watch in a general way, the way someone stands at a door not to keep people in, but to keep other things out. "Start from the beginning," Bear said. "Not the scary part, the beginning." Ellie swallowed. "The beginning isn't that different from the scary part. Try anyway." So she did. She told him about the house, about Ruth, about 32 years of payments made in pieces, of a woman who had worked 2 jobs for most of her adult life and had the kind of tired written into her body that doesn't come from laziness, but from the opposite of it. She told him about the October afternoon when Hooper had come to the door with his papers, and his smooth voice and his very careful way of saying threatening things without technically saying them. Bear listened without interrupting. His elbows were on his knees, his hands loose between them, his eyes on her face the whole time. Not the impatient kind of listening where someone is waiting for a pause so they can speak. The real kind. "He said he had documentation," Ellie said, "about the property line. Ruth has papers too, but..." She stopped. "But she's 71 years old and she doesn't have a lawyer, and Hooper kept sending people with clipboards, and it scared her. She doesn't say it scared her, but I can tell." "What did your grandmother do when the men with clipboards showed up?" "She made coffee," Ellie said. Something moved across Bear's face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. "Yeah?" "She told me once that the best way to handle someone who's trying to intimidate you is to act like you don't notice they're doing it. So she made coffee and offered them some, and they didn't know what to do with that." Ellie's voice was steady until it wasn't. "But that only works for so long." "No," Bear agreed, "it does. And then 3 weeks ago I was at the sink and I heard him outside the window, talking to someone I didn't know." She looked at her hands. "He said if she wouldn't leave, the house would leave first. He said property that doesn't exist anymore isn't worth fighting over." The alley was very quiet. "He said that," Bear said. "I heard it myself." Bear stood up slowly, not quickly, not sharply, just unfolded himself to full height and stood there for a moment with his arms at his sides. He was looking at the middle distance, somewhere past her shoulder, and his jaw was set in a way that changed the temperature of the air around him by about 3 degrees. "Rook," he said. "Yeah. Go get Tin and Garrett. Tell them to leave their coffee. Tell them it's not a question." The footsteps retreated immediately. Bear looked back at Ellie. "What street?" She told him. He nodded once. "How far from here?" 7 minutes walking, maybe 5 if you go fast." "We won't be walking," he said. She had not expected to be sitting on the back of a motorcycle. In the list of things Ellie had imagined might happen when she taped that dollar to a stranger's bike, this particular outcome had not appeared. And yet there she was, 3 minutes later, with both arms wrapped around Bear's midsection. He had said, flatly, "Hold on and don't let go. Doesn't matter what it feels like." And her heart doing something complicated in her chest as the row of motorcycles pulled away from the Iron Horse Diner in a sound that was less noise than physical force. A thing you felt in your sternum and your teeth. 5 bikes, Bear at the front, Tin and Garrett and 2 others whose names she hadn't caught flanking behind. Rook directly to Bear's right. 7 minutes of walking took less than 2 on the bikes. When they pulled up in front of the house, Ellie felt something shift in her that she couldn't name exactly. Relief, maybe, but not the soft kind, the hard kind, the kind that comes before something, not after it. She slid off the bike before Bear had the kickstand down. The house looked smaller than usual with the bikes in front of it. The porch light was on, even though it was still afternoon, because Ruth always left the porch light on when Ellie was out, which Ellie had told her 100 times was unnecessary, which Ruth had told her 100 times was not her call to make. The front door opened before Ellie reached the porch steps. Ruth stood in the doorway. She was a small woman, had always been small, Ellie knew, though the photographs from Ruth's younger years showed someone who'd carried her smallness with a density that was almost physical. Now, at 71, she wore it differently. Not fragile exactly, more like precise, like someone who had pared everything down to exactly what was necessary and nothing more. She looked at Ellie, then she looked at the 5 motorcycles parked along her curb. Then she looked at Bear. The look on Ruth's face cycled through approximately 6 emotions in about 4 seconds. Ellie watched all of them happen and couldn't have named them in order. "Eleanor Ruth Marsh," Ruth said. Ellie winced, all 3 names. "Grandma, you went and got the Hells Angels." "I went and got help." Ruth looked at Bear again. He was standing at the foot of the porch steps with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he had adopted an expression that Ellie had not yet seen on him, which was something that could only be described as careful respect. The kind you offer when you've walked into someone else's space and you know it. "Ma'am," he said. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you want coffee?" Bear blinked, just once. "We're all right, thank you." "I'll make a pot anyway," Ruth said. "Come inside, before the neighbors start talking more than they already do." She looked at the bikes. "All of you, bikes stay out there." Ellie looked at Bear. Bear looked at the door Ruth had already walked back through, then at his men, then at Ellie. "She always like that?" he said. "Always," Ellie said. Ruth's kitchen was small and warm and smelled like the coffee that was already brewing, which meant she had started it before she opened the door, which meant she had seen them coming from the window, which meant she had been watching for longer than she'd let on. Ellie filed that away. Bear sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface, and he did not take up less space than usual just because the kitchen was small, but he seemed aware of the space and calibrated accordingly. Tin and Rook sat on the other side of the table. Garrett and the remaining man, whose name Ellie would learn was Dutch, stayed in the living room doorway, not because they were told to, but because the kitchen genuinely could not accommodate more. Ruth set mugs down, poured without asking, sat across from Bear with a mug in her own hands, and looked at him the way she looked at most people, which was directly and without apology. "I know who you are," Ruth said. "Most people do," Bear said. "I know your reputation. Most people know that too. And you still came." Bear's eyes moved to Ellie, who was standing against the counter trying to look like she wasn't listening to every word. "Your granddaughter is persuasive." "She has been since she was 4 years old," Ruth said. "She negotiated an extra hour of TV time for 3 weeks straight before I figured out she'd been doing it." A pause. "I still don't know how she did it." For a fraction of a second, Bear smiled. Then the smile settled back into seriousness. "Tell me about Hooper." Ruth's hands tightened on the mug. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way hands tighten when a name arrives that carries weight. He wants the property, she said. He found some old survey document, or claims he did. He's been pressing me to leave voluntarily, says it'll be easier for everyone that way. Has he made any direct threats? Ruth was quiet. Grandma, Ellie said. Ruth looked at her, then back at Bear. He told me last week that structures in a disputed property zone are sometimes condemned for safety concerns, and that condemnation can happen very quickly if the right people are notified. She said it evenly, the way she said most things, but her hands on the mug had not relaxed. He said this while looking at my porch. Bear looked at the doorway toward the front of the house. At the porch he'd walked past. What is he doing with the land? He said. He want to build something? There's talk, Ruth said carefully, about a development, commercial property, the whole block, eventually. He's not the only one involved. He's just the one who lives next door, the one doing the groundwork. He's the face, Tin said from across the table. He's the hand, Ruth corrected. Someone else is the face. I just haven't figured out who yet. The kitchen was quiet except for the coffee maker finishing its cycle. Bear picked up his mug and held it without drinking and said, "How much time do you think you have?" "I think," Ruth said slowly, "that I have very little." Ellie pushed off from the counter. "I heard him say 2 days, maybe less. That was 2 days ago." Everyone at the table understood the math. Bear stepped outside to make a call. Ellie watched through the kitchen window as he walked to the edge of the porch, phone to his ear, and had a conversation that she couldn't hear, but could read in parts from his posture. The way he stood when he was listening, the way it changed when he was talking, the way his free hand came up once and made a gesture that was definitive and final. Rook refilled his own coffee and leaned against the counter near Ellie. He was young enough that she didn't feel as immediately intimidated by him, which she suspected was not an accident, that Bear had put him nearby on purpose. "He's calling someone?" she asked. "He's calling several someones," Rook said. "What kind of someones?" Rook looked at her sideways. "The kind that make other someones reconsider their plans." "That's not specific." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She crossed her arms. "Is this going to work?" Rook considered the question with what felt like genuine seriousness, which she appreciated more than a quick reassurance would have given her. "Bear's been doing this a long time," he finally said. "He doesn't go into something he's not going to see through." "That's also not specific." "No," he said again, "but it's true." Bear came back inside. He set the phone on the table and looked at Ruth. "I made some calls. There's a man in this county who tracks property acquisition activity, commercial mostly. He's been watching the Hooper situation from a distance. Turns out you're not the only property on this block being pressured. You're just the one who's held on the longest." Ruth set her mug down. "How many others?" "3 have already left. 2 were renters. They moved without much resistance. 1 owned, but he was old and sick, and his family made the call for him." Bear's voice was not cold when he said this, just factual in the way facts sometimes demand. "The pattern's been going on for about 14 months. The air in the kitchen changed. Ellie felt it before she understood it. A kind of heaviness that comes when something private becomes something bigger. When a fight you thought was yours alone turns out to belong to a wider, uglier story. 14 months, Ruth said quietly. "You've been the slowdown they didn't plan for," Bear said, "which means the timeline's been pushed, and pushed timelines make people impatient. Impatient people make mistakes." He looked at the table, and impatient people also accelerate. "He's going to move tonight," Ellie said. It wasn't a question. She felt it the way she had felt things before when they were true, in her stomach, not her head. Bear looked at her. "Probably," he said, not softening it, giving her the real answer. "Which is why we're not going anywhere." Ruth tried to send them home at 7 o'clock. Not because she didn't want the help. Ellie knew better than that. Ruth tried to send them home because Ruth was the kind of woman who had trouble accepting that a thing needed to be given to her. 32 years of doing everything herself had carved that into her as deep as bone. "You have your own lives," she told Bear. You don't need to be sitting on someone else's porch in the dark. We're not on your porch, Bear said. He was in the living room, standing near the window in a way that looked casual but wasn't. We're in your house. Different thing. Bear, Ruth used his name the way she used Ellie's full name, with a kind of authority that did not require volume. I am grateful. I want you to know that, but I don't need babysitting. Respectfully, ma'am, Bear said, I didn't come here to babysit you. I came here because someone asked for my help, and I said yes, and I'm not in the habit of going back on that. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Fine, she said, but I'm making dinner. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Ruth said, and she was already moving toward the kitchen. Sit down. Ellie caught Bear's expression as he turned back to the window. He looked like a man who was used to being the most immovable thing in any room and had just discovered there were exceptions. She does that, Ellie said quietly. Yeah, he said, I see that. Does it bother you? He was quiet for a second. No, he said, actually it doesn't. Dinner was a thing that Ellie would think about for a long time after, not for what happened during it, but for what it felt like, which was strange and specific and not entirely explainable. 6 large men in leather vests sitting around a kitchen table that had only ever sat 2, eating rice and beans and cornbread that Ruth made from scratch in 40 minutes, talking in low voices about nothing important, roads, weather, a story Tin told about a breakdown in Oklahoma 2 summers ago that was apparently very funny if you hadn't been the one breaking down. Ruth listened and refilled plates and said very little, but Ellie watched her grandmother's hands, and by the time the meal was over, those hands had relaxed. It was the most important thing Ellie saw all night. At 9:47, Dutch appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had been outside, Ellie knew, he and Garrett alternating, taking turns walking the perimeter of the block in a pattern that looked like nothing but wasn't. Bear, Dutch said. Just the name, nothing else. Bear was on his feet before Dutch finished the syllable. What? Truck, 2 blocks over, parked in the dark. 2 men in it. They've been there 40 minutes. Bear looked at the window, then at Rook, then at Tin. Garrett still out? He's watching the truck. Don't approach it, Bear said. Not yet. Dutch nodded and stepped back. Ellie felt the dinner she had just eaten sit differently in her stomach. Is it him? She asked. Bear didn't answer right away. He moved to the window and stood there, not looking out directly but at an angle, the practiced way of someone who has spent time in situations where being seen looking can change things. Can't know yet, he said, but we're about to find out. Ruth was still at the table. She had not moved. She was holding her coffee mug with both hands, and her expression was the most composed thing in the room, not because she wasn't afraid, but because Ruth had made her relationship with fear a long time ago, and she knew how to sit across from it. Eleanor, she said. Ellie turned. Come sit with me. Grandma, I'm not asking you to be weak, Ruth said. I'm asking you to be here, right here, with me. Ellie walked to the table and sat down. Ruth reached across and put her hand over Ellie's without making a production of it. A simple weight, warm, steady. Bear glanced back at them. Whatever he thought in that moment, he kept it in his chest. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, then he said quietly and without drama, It's him. He looked at his men. Okay, he said. Time to have a conversation. Bear's phone buzzed a second time before he had finished reading the first message. He read the second one. Set the phone face down on the windowsill. Looked at Rook. How many? Rook asked. Garrett counts 4. 2 in the truck, 2 on foot coming around the backside of the block. They split up. Bear's voice was level, the way a road is level when it's been built right. Not because the ground underneath it was easy, but because someone put the work in to make it steady. They planned this. They're not just impatient. They came organized. Tin stood up from the couch. So did we. That's right, Bear said. Ellie was still at the kitchen table, her hand under Ruth's, and she heard every word through the doorway. She didn't move. She had made a decision somewhere in the last 10 seconds that she was going to be still and let this happen. Not because she was helpless, but because Bear knew what he was doing, and the best thing she could do right now was not get in the middle of it. Ruth's thumb moved once across the back of her hand, slow, like a metronome. Still here, still here, still here. Dutch, Bear said. Yeah, go back out, circle left toward the alley side. Don't let the two on foot get close to the back of the house. You don't have to confront them. Just be visible. A pause. You understand the difference? I understand the difference, Dutch said, and then he was gone. Garrett's still on the truck? Tin asked. Garrett's on the truck. Bear picked his phone back up and typed something short. Sent it. He'll hold until I move. And when do we move? Rook asked. Bear looked at the window, at the angle of the light outside, at whatever calculations were happening behind his eyes that nobody else in the room could see. Now, he said. The thing about Vance Hooper was that he was used to winning. That was the root of it, Ellie would understand later. Not that he was cruel exactly, though he was, and not that he was fearless, though he played at it. It was that he had moved through 47 years of life making people smaller than him, and it had always worked. So he had come to believe that the size difference was a permanent fact of nature, rather than a temporary arrangement that could be altered. He was about to have that belief corrected. He had parked the truck 2 blocks over, not because he was cautious by nature, but because the man who'd planned this with him, the man behind the development project whose name Ruth had not yet learned but was about to, had insisted on it. Don't park in front of the property, that man had said. You want distance. You want it to look like nothing to do with you. So Hooper had parked 2 blocks over, and his men had walked, and he had sat in that truck for 40 minutes telling himself this was the last time he'd have to deal with this particular obstacle. He was on the phone when Bear knocked on the passenger window. Not hard, 3 knocks. Patient. Hooper froze. He turned his head. Bear was standing at the passenger side of the truck, and the expression on his face was the most unsettling kind. Not rage, not threat, just absolute stillness, the way a wall is still. Behind Bear, visible through the windshield, were Tin and Rook. On the driver's side, Hooper turned and found Garrett standing with his arms folded, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. Hooper had a man in the truck with him, a guy he'd hired 2 weeks ago, a guy who was big and had never had a problem making himself useful in situations that required a different kind of persuasion. That man looked at Garrett now and did not move. Bear knocked on the passenger window again. Same 3 knocks. Same patience. Hooper opened the door. Mr. Hooper, Bear said. Hooper got out slowly. He was a little under 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who had probably been physically confident his whole life, and was now recalibrating that confidence in real time. Who are you? He said. I'm the inconvenience you didn't plan for, Bear said. Can I ask what you're doing parked 2 blocks from an elderly woman's house at 9:50 at night with 4 men? I don't have to answer that. No, Bear agreed, you don't. That single word, don't, hung there for a second, and Hooper felt the shape of it, felt that Bear was not arguing with him, not threatening him, just stating a fact, which was somehow worse than either of those things. You're trespassing, Hooper said. This is a public street. My men. Your men are where my men can see them, Bear said, which is where they'll stay. Hooper looked past Bear at Tin and Rook, then behind him at Garrett. He licked his lip once, just once, and that small, involuntary movement told Bear everything he needed to know about where the power in the conversation sat. You have no idea what you're getting involved in, Hooper said. His voice had recovered something. Not confidence, something thinner than confidence, a performance of it. This is a legal matter, property law. This is not your business. A 12-year-old girl made it my business, Bear said. Hooper blinked. About $1 worth, Bear added, so I'd say it's very much my business right now. Inside the house, Ellie heard the motorcycles start. Not all of them, just one, and then a second, idling up slow, and then moving. She heard them shift position, and she gripped the edge of the table, and Ruth tightened her hand over hers. They know what they're doing, Ruth said. I know, Ellie said, but you're going to worry anyway. I'm already worrying. That's fine, Ruth said. Worrying is just caring with nowhere to put itself, as long as you don't let it make your decisions for you. Ellie looked at her grandmother. You're not scared at all. Ruth's eyes met hers. I'm terrified, she said simply. I've been terrified since October. But I decided a long time ago that being terrified and being functional were two different things, and I was going to be the second one. Ellie thought about that. She thought about the sink 3 weeks ago, and the voice outside the window, and the way she had stood there with soap on her hands and cold water running and made a decision in the dark that led to this kitchen, to this table, to the sound of motorcycles positioning themselves in the dark outside. Grandma, she said, what if it doesn't work? Ruth was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, the quiet of someone who was giving it the respect it deserved. Then we find another way, she said. But right now, I think it's going to work. How do you know? Ruth looked toward the window. Because that man out there, she said, meaning Bear, has the same look your grandfather used to get, right before he finished something. Ellie had never met her grandfather. He had died before she was born, but she had seen the photographs, and she had heard Ruth talk about him in the specific, precise way that people talk about someone they love completely and lost completely and had made their peace with. And she understood, from the way Ruth said it now, that the comparison was not small. Hooper was still talking. This was a thing Bear had noticed about men like Hooper over the years. When they were backed against something, they talked. They reasoned, justified, explained, redirected, and when all of that ran dry, they threatened. And then when the threat didn't land the way they expected, they went back to talking again, because talking felt like action, and action felt like control. You can't hold me here, Hooper was saying. This isn't legal. What you're doing right now. What am I doing? Bear asked. You're intimidating me. This is intimidation. That's criminal. I knocked on your truck window, Bear said, and I'm having a conversation with you on a public street. He tilted his head slightly. What part of that is illegal? The man in the truck shifted. Bear didn't look at him. He didn't need to. He knew Garrett was watching. Here's what I want you to understand, Bear said. His voice had dropped. Not lower in volume exactly, but lower in register. The way a room gets quieter right before something important. I know about the 14 months. I know about the 3 properties. I know about the development plan, and I know about the people behind it. He watched Hooper's face, watched the calculation happening there. I also know about the conversations that have happened outside windows when certain people thought nobody was listening. Hooper's jaw tightened. You have a witness problem, Bear said. That's not a 12-year-old girl, Bear said, who heard everything, and who will repeat everything to anyone who needs to hear it. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. That changes your legal situation, doesn't it? The silence that followed was the most complete silence Ellie had ever produced without being present for it. Hooper looked at Bear with something new in his expression. Not fear, not yet. But the frontier of it, the place where confidence ends and the territory beyond, has no name. What do you want? Hooper said. I want you to turn your truck around, Bear said. Tonight, right now. I want your men to walk back to wherever they came from. And I want you to understand very clearly that this house is off limits. Tonight, tomorrow, next week, next month. He let a beat pass. The family that lives there is off limits. You don't approach them. You don't send people with clipboards. You don't have late-night conversations outside windows. You can't enforce that. Mr. Hooper. Bear's voice was so quiet now that Hooper had to lean forward slightly to catch it, which meant Bear had him exactly where he wanted him. We don't call police. We don't call lawyers. We handle things the way we handle things, and we are very, very good at it. You want to ask anyone in 3 counties about that, you are welcome to make some calls. He straightened up to full height. Or you can make one decision right now that costs you nothing but a bruised ego and saves you considerably more than that. Hooper looked at his man in the truck. His man looked back at him and offered absolutely nothing helpful. "And the property dispute?" Hooper said. His voice had changed, thinner. "The legal claim is going to be looked at very closely by someone who does this professionally," Bear said. "You take a fraudulent property claim to court with a minor witness who heard you make explicit threats against a residence, and you will not like where that ends up." The word fraudulent hit like a flat stone dropping into still water. Ripples moved across Hooper's face. "I'm not saying it's fraudulent," Bear said. "I'm saying that's how it's going to look to the people who see the whole picture." Another silence, longer this time. Rook, standing behind Bear's left shoulder, kept his eyes forward and his expression blank, which was not easy because what he was feeling was something with no clean name. Not pride, not excitement, more like the sensation of watching something true be said out loud in front of the person it needed to be said to. "You're going to walk away from this," Bear said, "or I'm going to make sure everyone with a stake in your development project understands exactly the kind of noise their project is going to generate." He looked at Hooper steadily. "I have a lot of friends. I cover a lot of ground, and I carry things from town to town the way you'd carry a letter. You understand what I'm telling you?" Hooper was quiet for a very long time. Then, with the slow, controlled movement of a man who was making a decision he did not want to make, but understood was the only available one, he turned back to his truck. "Tell your men to stand down," Bear said. Hooper pulled out his phone, typed something, sent it. A moment later, Bear's own phone buzzed. He looked at it. Dutch, reporting from the back alley. "They're leaving." Bear nodded once. "Good," he said. "Go home, Mr. Hooper." The truck door closed, the engine started, and Vance Hooper drove away. Ellie heard the truck before she understood what the sound meant. She heard the engine start, heard it move, heard it grow distant in a way that felt different from the earlier sounds of the night. Not a circling sound, not a waiting sound, a leaving sound. She stood up from the table so fast her chair scraped back. "Ellie," Ruth said. "I need to see," she said. She went to the front door and opened it. Bear was walking up the porch steps. He looked tired in a way he hadn't looked 2 hours ago. Not physically tired, more like something had been spent in him that took time to replenish. He stopped at the top step and looked at her and he said, "He's gone." Ellie looked past him at the street, at Rook and Tin and Garrett and Dutch, standing by the bikes, talking in low voices, a normal collection of people doing a normal thing, as if the last 40 minutes had been nothing at all. "He's gone," she repeated. "For now," Bear said, not qualifying it to scare her, qualifying it because he was honest, and she had earned that. "But he'll try again," she said. "Not in the same way," Bear said. "Not without thinking harder about it. And that thinking is what we need time for." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the dollar bill, slightly creased from being in his pocket all day. He held it out to her. "Your retainer." She looked at it. "I told you to keep it." "You hired us," he said. "Job's not done." She took the dollar. She looked down at it in her palm, soft from too much folding, one corner still bearing the ghost of tape residue. This thing she had pressed against a stranger's motorcycle in an alley with shaking hands and a desperation so complete it had felt like a kind of freedom. She closed her fingers around it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Bear said, We talk about the part you haven't told me yet. She looked up.
What part?
His eyes were level on hers, and they held that same quality they'd had in the alley. Not soft, not hard, but real. The kind of honest attention that does not look away. The man behind Hooper, he said. The one your grandmother said she hadn't figured out yet. He tilted his head slightly. I think you have an idea. I think you've had one for a while. Ellie's breath came in slowly. She thought about the library, about 2 days of searching on Miss Patton's computer, about the names she had found attached to 3 different property acquisitions in the county over the past 18 months, tucked into public records under an LLC that had another LLC inside it, like a set of boxes designed to make you stop opening them. A name she had written on the back of another receipt and folded up in her shoe because she hadn't known what to do with it yet. She looked at Bear. How much trouble could that person cause? She asked. Bear held her gaze. A lot, he said, if they see it coming. And if they don't? He was quiet for one beat. Come inside, she said. I need to show you something. She turned back toward the house, and Bear followed, and the screen door swung shut behind them both with the small, specific sound of a story moving into its next chapter. Ruth looked up from the table when they came back in. She looked at Bear's face, then at Ellie's. She read them both the way she read most things, quickly, accurately, without making a fuss about it. Sit down, she said, both of you. She got up and went to the stove. I'll make more coffee, she said. This is going to take a while. Ellie reached into her shoe. Ruth, standing at the stove, did not comment on this. Bear, sitting at the kitchen table, watched without expression. Rook had come back inside and was leaning in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and he watched too. And none of them said anything while Ellie unfolded the receipt and smoothed it flat against the table with the palm of her hand. The name was written in pencil, small, careful letters, the handwriting of someone who had learned early that precision mattered. Alderman Construction Group, R. Caldwell, Principal. She pushed it across the table to Bear. He looked at it. He looked at it for longer than she expected, which told her something. Not that he recognized the name, though she suspected he might, but that the name meant more than just a name, that it was attached to something with shape and weight that he was measuring in his head. Raymond Caldwell, Bear said. You know him, Ellie said. Not a question. I know of him, Bear said, which was a different thing, and he was careful to make the distinction. He builds things, has built things all over this part of the state for the better part of 20 years. Shopping plazas, strip developments, the kind of commercial real estate that looks the same in every town. He set the receipt down. He is not a man who gets his hands dirty. He finds people like Hooper to do the part he doesn't want connected to his name. Which is why you can't find him in the public records easy, Ellie said. The LLCs. There are 2 of them between his name and the property acquisitions. I found them at the library. Miss Patton helped me. She didn't know what she was helping with, but she showed me how to search the county filings. Bear looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one where he recalibrated something about her. How long did it take you? 2 afternoons. You're 12. I know how old I am. Rook made a sound in the doorway that was either a cough or a suppressed laugh. Either way, Bear did not acknowledge it. Ruth set 2 fresh mugs on the table and sat down. She looked at the receipt, at the name. She said nothing for a moment, and the nothing she said had a particular quality, the kind that precedes something true. He came to a neighborhood meeting, Ruth said, 3 years ago. Introduced himself as a local investor interested in community development. He brought a presentation, coffee and muffins. Her voice was flat. He looked everybody in the eye and talked about revitalizing the area, about bringing jobs, about making things better for residents. She was quiet. He was very good at it. He's always good at it, Bear said. 3 years, Ellie said. He's been planning this for 3 years. At least, Bear said. Maybe longer. Caldwell doesn't move fast. He studies a block, maps the owners, identifies the weaknesses. He's patient in the way that makes him dangerous, because by the time you understand what's happening, the groundwork is already laid. Ruth wrapped both hands around her mug. Hooper is his groundwork. Hooper is one of his tools, Bear said. When Hooper fails, there will be another one. That's how Caldwell works. He doesn't have a plan B. He has a plan C, D, and E, all of them already running. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the house settling, the small creaks of an old structure that had stood through 32 years of weather and hadn't decided to stop yet. Ellie looked at Bear. So sending Hooper away tonight doesn't fix it. Tonight was necessary, Bear said, but no, it doesn't fix it. Then what does? Bear looked at the receipt, at the name written in a 12-year-old's careful pencil. Sunlight, he said. Caldwell can operate in shadow. He cannot operate when people can see what he's doing. What does that mean practically? It means the story of what happened on this block. All of it. 14 months, 3 displaced families, a fraudulent property claim, a man who sent 4 others to do something to a house at night. That story has to go somewhere. It can't be buried. He picked up his phone. I know a journalist. Ruth looked up sharply. Not tabloid, Bear said. Investigative. Local, but connected to a state paper. She's been covering commercial real estate corruption for 6 years, and she's been looking for a thread that leads to Caldwell for the last 2 of them. He held the phone. She's going to want to talk to both of you. Ruth and Ellie looked at each other. She's going to want to talk to a 71-year-old woman and a 12-year-old girl, Ellie said slowly. Yes, because we're the story. You're the proof, Bear said. There's a difference. The story is Caldwell. You're the part that makes it real to people who've never met him and wouldn't recognize his name on a form. Ellie turned the idea over in her head. The part of her that had been scared all along was still scared, because this was a different category of exposure than she had bargained for when she taped $1 to a motorcycle. Being scared was one thing. Being visible was something else entirely. But she thought about the 3 families who had already left. The renter who had moved without much resistance, the old man who was sick and whose family had made the call for him. She thought about all the people who had been moved out of the way quietly, in the dark, without anyone ever knowing what had actually happened to them. She picked up the receipt and looked at the name. Okay, she said. Bear looked at her. Okay? Call her, Ellie said. The journalist's name was Sandra Holt, and she answered on the second ring at 10:15 at night, which told Ellie something about the kind of work she did and the relationship she had with it. Bear moved to the living room to make the call, which gave Ellie and Ruth 5 minutes alone at the kitchen table, which was exactly the right amount of time and not 1 minute more. Ruth reached across and covered Ellie's hand again. You understand what you're doing. I think so. Not just tonight, after tonight. When the story comes out, Caldwell will know where it started. I know. And you're not afraid. I am afraid, Ellie said. But you told me afraid and functional are different things. Ruth looked at her for a long moment with an expression that had multiple layers, and the top layer was composed, and the bottom layer was something fiercer and more tender than Ellie had words for. I said that about myself, Ruth said. I'm borrowing it. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but carried the weight of both. She squeezed Ellie's hand once, hard, and let go. Bear came back in. She's coming, he said. Tonight? Ruth said. She was already working. He sat back down. She'll be here in 40 minutes. She wants everything. Documents, the receipt, whatever you heard outside the window, the timeline. He looked at Ellie. She's going to ask you hard questions. She won't do it to be unkind. She'll do it because the story has to hold up. It will hold up, Ellie said. It's true. True things still have to be told in the right way, Bear said. Tell it the way you told it to me, from the beginning. Not the scary part, the beginning. She almost smiled at that. You used my own line on me. It was a good line, he said. Sandra Holt was smaller than her byline suggested, which was not a thing Ellie had ever thought about a person before, that a byline could have a size. She was maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a recorder she set on the table without asking permission. And she moved through the kitchen with the energy of someone who had walked into 100 situations like this, which was reassuring and slightly intimidating in equal measure. She shook Ruth's hand. She shook Ellie's hand. She looked at Bear and said, "You could have called me last year about this." "I didn't know about it last year," Bear said. "Fair," she said. She sat down, looked at Ellie directly. "You found the LLC connection yourself?" "At the library," Ellie said. Sandra looked at her recorder, then at Ellie. "How old are you?" 12. Sandra nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had been told, but needed to verify in person. "Start from the beginning," she said. "I'll stop you when I need to." Ellie started from the beginning. She told it cleanly, which was the only way she knew how to tell things, because she had rehearsed it only in her own head, and her own head did not have patience for excess. The October afternoon, the papers, the clipboards, the voice outside the window, the library, the receipt, the dollar. Sandra did not interrupt except twice, once to ask about the exact phrasing Hooper had used outside the window, once to ask Ruth about the neighborhood meeting 3 years ago, and whether she remembered other attendees who might be willing to talk. Ruth remembered 6 names without hesitating. Sandra wrote all 6 down. "The LLC structure," Sandra said, looking at the receipt. "You found this how specifically?" "County property filings," Ellie said. "One LLC had filed a preliminary interest notice on 4 properties on our block. I searched the registered agent for that LLC and found it pointed to a second LLC. The second one had Raymond Caldwell listed as principal officer in a filing from 4 years ago. They updated it after that, took his name off the public documents, but the older filing is still there." Sandra stared at her. "I'm 12, Ellie said, "not 3. Something cracked in Sandra's expression. Not unprofessionally, more like the involuntary response of someone who has just been surprised by a child and doesn't see the point in pretending otherwise. She wrote something in her notebook and underlined it twice. Bear, sitting back from the table with his arms folded, watched this all happen and said nothing. Tin appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Bear." His voice was quiet, but it had an edge. Bear stood up in one motion. "What?" "Garrett just called. There's a car parked down the block. Different car, different plates. Been there about 20 minutes. Sandra looked up from her notebook. "Caldwell?" Ellie said. "Caldwell doesn't park his own car," Bear said. His jaw was set. He looked at Tin. "License plate," Tin told him. Bear typed it into his phone and sent it somewhere. He waited 15 seconds and the response came back, and his expression did something that Ellie had not seen it do yet, which was tighten in a specific, involuntary way that meant what he'd received was unexpected. "What?" Rook said. Bear looked at Sandra. Sandra looked back at him. "The plate," Bear said carefully, "is registered to a vehicle belonging to a private security firm. One that does contract work for..." He stopped, looked at the receipt on the table. "For Alderman Construction Group." The kitchen went very, very quiet. Caldwell hadn't sent Hooper as his next move. Caldwell had sent someone to watch, which meant Caldwell already knew Hooper had failed, which meant someone had called him the moment Bear walked up to that truck window, which meant there had been a third set of eyes on the street that none of them had accounted for. "He has a watcher," Ellie said. "He had a watcher," Bear said. "Past tense matters." "Why past tense?" Bear looked at Sandra. "How fast can you file?" Sandra sat up straighter. "Depends what I'm filing." "I need the story on record tonight," Bear said. "Not published, on record, time-stamped, sourced, submitted to your editor in a way that creates a paper trail that predates anything that might happen between now in mourning. Sandra's eyes moved quickly across the room, touching the faces of everyone in it, processing, calculating. She was a woman who understood exactly what Bear was saying and what it meant, and she did not need it explained a second time. "I can file a draft with my editor tonight," she said, "with documentation. That creates the record you're describing." "How long?" She looked at the notebook in her hand, at the recorder, at the receipt on the table. "Give me the LLC documents, everything Ellie found at the library. I can write down the filing numbers," Ellie said immediately. "Do that," Sandra said. She was already typing on her phone, one-handed, with the fluid speed of someone who had trained herself to document while talking. "Bear, I need a statement from you on tonight. What you saw, what was said, the plate on Hooper's truck. You'll have it." "Ruth," Sandra looked at her, "I need your property documentation. Whatever you have, deed, payment records, anything that establishes the timeline of your ownership." Ruth stood up. "I'll get it," she said, and went down the hall toward the back bedroom without hurrying, because Ruth did not hurry, but she also did not waste time. And there was a difference. Ellie was already writing the filing numbers on a fresh receipt from Sandra's bag, her handwriting fast, but still precise. Bear was dictating something quietly into Sandra's recorder near the window. Rook was on his phone in the doorway, relaying something to Garrett outside. The kitchen had transformed, in the space of 4 minutes, from a place of waiting into a place of action. And Ellie felt it in the air the way you feel a change in weather, in your skin before you feel it anywhere else. Then Ruth came back into the kitchen. She was carrying a manila folder, worn at the edges, the kind of folder that had been handled many times over many years and was still intact because the person who kept it believed in keeping things intact. She set it on the table. Sandra reached for it, and then something stopped her. Not a sound, not a movement. Sandra was looking at the top of the folder where Ruth had written something in marker a long time ago. A date, Ellie saw. A date that was 32 years ago. "This is your original deed," Sandra said. "And everything after it," Ruth said. "Every payment, every receipt, every letter I've received from Hooper in the county office." She sat down. "I have kept records of everything since the day I bought this house. Because my mother told me that a black woman in this country who does not keep records of what belongs to her will eventually find that it no longer belongs to her." Her voice did not shake. "I keep records." Sandra opened the folder. She went through the first 3 pages, and her expression shifted in the way that expressions shift when someone moves from expecting something to finding something better. She looked at Bear. "This is..." She stopped, looked at the documents again. "This property title is clean, completely clean. The survey Hooper cited, I can see from these records that the county revised that survey boundary 19 years ago. It's on record." She looked up. "The property line claim Hooper filed was based on a version of the survey that was officially superseded almost 2 decades ago." Bear said nothing. Ellie looked at her grandmother. "You knew." Ruth met her eyes. "I suspected," she said quietly. "I was not certain. I knew my records were correct. I did not know if anyone would believe they were correct without a lawyer standing behind them." "You didn't need a lawyer," Sandra said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite wonder and not quite fury, but lived between them. "You needed someone to actually look." "People don't look," Ruth said. "They see an old woman with a folder and they think sentiment. They don't think documentation." The table was silent. Ellie turned to look at Bear. He was looking at Ruth with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the patient authority of the alley, not the controlled steadiness of the street. Something older than both of those. Something that had no professional name. He looked like a man who had just been shown something he had always believed was real, proven true. "The story isn't just Caldwell," he said to Sandra. "No," Sandra said, her pen already moving. "It never was. It's the system that let Caldwell do this for 14 months without anyone looking at a folder. That's the better story, Sandra said. That's the harder story. Yes. She did not stop writing. Those are usually the same. At 11:43, Sandra sent her draft. Ellie was sitting on the couch in the living room, Ruth's cardigan draped over her shoulders, when Sandra came out of the kitchen and looked at her phone and said, "It's time-stamped. My editor has it. The documentation is attached." She looked at Bear. "If anything happens to this house between now and when the story publishes, the paper will treat it as retaliation against the source. That has legal weight." "How long until publication?" Bear said. "Depends on how fast legal clears it. 2 days, maybe 3 if they want more sourcing on the Caldwell LLC structure." She looked at Ellie. "I may need to call you." "I'll be here," Ellie said. Sandra picked up her recorder. She looked around the kitchen one more time, at the worn table, the folder of documents, the mugs of coffee, the men in leather who had rearranged this evening into something that had a different shape than it was supposed to have. "Thank you," she said. It was addressed to the room in general, and to Ruth in particular. Ruth nodded once. "Coffee for the road?" "I'm fine," Sandra said, and she almost smiled, and she left. The screen door closed behind her. The house was quieter after she was gone, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This was a quieter quiet, the kind that exists after something has been set in motion, after the last piece has been placed and you are waiting for the structure to show itself. Ellie sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "What does the car outside do now?" "Caldwell's watcher." Bear had been looking at his phone. He put it in his pocket. "Nothing useful," he said. "Any move they make now creates a record that helps us. So we just wait." "We let the night finish," Bear said. "That's different from waiting." She understood the distinction without him explaining it. Waiting was passive. Letting the night finish meant trusting that the work was done, that the pieces were where they needed to be, that morning would arrive and be different from the morning before it. She pulled Ruth's cardigan tighter around her shoulders. From the kitchen came the sound of Bear's men talking. Low, unhurried, the sound of people who were comfortable in the in-between, who had learned to exist in the space between the doing and the knowing. Ruth appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and looked at Ellie with those precise, accurate eyes. "Bed," she said. Ellie opened her mouth. "They are not leaving," Ruth said before Ellie could speak. "They will be here. I will be here. And you have school in 6 hours." "Grandma." "Eleanor." Ruth's voice was gentle and absolute, the way it always was when both those things were necessary at the same time. "You have done everything you can do tonight, more than you should have had to do. Let the rest of it be." Ellie looked toward the living room window, at the darkness past it, at whatever was still out there, watching or not watching, present or retreating. She thought about the dollar in her pocket. She thought about the alley this morning, a lifetime ago, standing against a wall with her knees pulled up and her heart hammering, waiting to see if a crumpled note and a soft dollar and a desperate hope were enough to change something. She looked at Bear, who was standing near the window with his phone in his hand, and the same particular stillness he'd had all night. The kind that was not passivity, but readiness. The kind that stays as long as it needs to and leaves when the job is done. He looked up and caught her looking at him. "Go to sleep," he said. Same thing as Ruth, different voice, equally non-negotiable. Ellie stood up, folded the cardigan over the arm of the couch, looked at the room, the men, her grandmother, the worn table in the kitchen, the folder of documents that had existed quietly for 32 years, waiting for the moment when someone would finally look. She walked past Bear toward the hallway. She stopped. "Bear." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "I know that's not enough for what—" "It's enough," he said. And then, because he was honest, and she had earned that every single time, "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be its own kind of long." She went to bed. She did not think she would sleep. She was wrong. Ellie woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of voices she recognized. For about 3 seconds, she didn't remember. She was just a girl in a bed, morning light coming through curtains, the ordinary sounds of a house being lived in. Then the 3 seconds ended and everything came back. The alley, the dollar, Bear's voice saying, "You hired us," Hooper's truck pulling away in the dark, Sandra's recorder on the kitchen table, the folder that Ruth had kept for 32 years because her mother had told her to keep records of what belonged to her. She sat up. The house was still standing. She put her feet on the floor and sat there for a moment with that fact, letting it be real. Then she stood up, pulled on yesterday's clothes, and went to the kitchen. Bear was at the table with a mug. Ruth was at the stove. Rook was asleep on the couch, which Ellie could tell from the particular quality of silence coming from the living room. Not watchful silence, sleeping silence. Tin was by the front window. Dutch and Garrett were not visible, which meant they were outside. "The car is gone," Bear said before she could ask. She sat down. "When?" "Around 2 in the morning. Garrett watched it leave and followed it 2 blocks to confirm the direction." Bear looked at his mug. "They're not coming back tonight. Tonight is over." "And Caldwell?" "Caldwell is waking up this morning to a problem he didn't have yesterday," Bear said. "He doesn't know the shape of it yet, but he will." Ruth set a plate in front of Ellie without being asked. Eggs and toast, the same breakfast as every morning, the ordinary weight of it sitting against everything that was not ordinary. And that contrast was what made Ellie's eyes sting unexpectedly. She pressed the back of her wrist against her eyes quickly and picked up her fork. Ruth sat down across from her and did not comment on the wrist or the eyes. She just poured her own coffee and wrapped her hands around the mug and said, "The porch board, 3rd from the top, needs fixing. Has needed it for 3 months. I keep meaning to get to it." Ellie looked at her. "Grandma." "I'm just saying," Ruth said. "It's on my list." Bear looked at Ruth. At the mention of the porch, at the way Ruth had dropped it into the conversation like a stone into still water, not to make a ripple, but to make a point. That this house was still here, that its ordinary needs were still hers to tend to, that the ordinary and the extraordinary were going to have to learn to exist on the same morning. "I can fix a porch board," Bear said. Ruth looked at him. "I didn't ask." "I know you didn't." A beat. "3rd from the top," Ruth said. "It's soft in the middle. You step wrong, you'll go through." "I'll be careful," Bear said. Sandra called at 9:41. Ellie was sitting on the kitchen counter. Ruth had stopped trying to keep her off the counter approximately 4 years ago. With the dollar bill in her hand, turning it over, when Bear's phone went off and he said Sandra's name and walked to the living room. She listened to his side of the conversation, which was almost entirely silence punctuated by short affirmatives. "How many?" he said. And then, "Both of them?" And then, after a longer pause, "Yeah, tell her she can have the quote." He looked at Ellie across the room. "Tell her the girl gave it to you already. She just doesn't know it yet." He came back to the kitchen and sat down. Ellie waited. "Her editor fast-tracked it," Bear said. "It's publishing today. Online first. State paper picks it up by evening." He held her eyes steadily. "The story names Caldwell. It names the LLC structure. It names the 3 families who were displaced, 2 of whom Sandra reached this morning and got on record." He paused. "It names Hooper, and it names this house and what was attempted here last night." The air in the kitchen changed the way it changes right before a storm breaks. That particular pressure, that sense of the moment before impact becoming the moment of it. "It names us," Ellie said. "It names you," Bear said. "Ruth and you. With your permission, Sandra won't run it without your consent." Ellie looked at Ruth. Ruth was looking at the folder on the counter, the worn manila folder she had carried from the back bedroom last night. 32 years of paper, every payment and receipt and letter, the whole slow record of a woman who had refused to let her life be undocumented. "She has my consent," Ruth said. She did not look up from the folder. Ellie turned the dollar over one more time, looked at it. "She has mine too." Bear nodded, typed the reply and sent it. The three of them sat in the kitchen while the morning moved around them, and nobody said anything for a minute. And the minute was not uncomfortable but full, the way silences are full when everyone in them understands the weight of what has just been done and is taking time to feel it before moving on. Then Rook appeared in the doorway from the living room, hair flattened on one side, eyes not fully open. "Did I miss something?" "The story's running today," Bear said. Rook became significantly more awake. Today? Today. Rook exhaled, looked at Ellie, looked at Ruth, ran a hand over his face and said, Okay, that's today." Ruth stood up and went to the coffee maker without a word. The story went live at 11:22 in the morning. Sandra had sent Bear the link, and Bear had handed his phone to Ellie, and Ellie had read the first 3 paragraphs standing in the kitchen with her heart rate doing something complicated, and then had handed the phone to Ruth, who had read the whole thing sitting at the table without speaking, with an expression so controlled and so complete that Ellie couldn't have named what was underneath it if she tried. Ruth finished reading, set the phone face down on the table, picked up her coffee, and drank from it. "She got it right," Ruth said. "She did," Bear said. "She got the part about the survey right, the part about the 19-year-old revision. That's the part that matters legally." "It's the part that ends Caldwell's claim," Bear said. "On paper, in public, with documentation. He can't proceed with a development that's premised on a property acquisition that's publicly documented as legally baseless." Ruth was quiet. "Then he'll find another angle." "Maybe," Bear said, "but not on this property, not with this story on record, and not with 3 more families now willing to talk." He leaned forward slightly. "The other 2 displaced families Sandra reached this morning, one of them has already called a housing attorney. The attorney is already talking about a coordinated claim against the LLC." Ruth set her mug down slowly. "A coordinated claim? It changes what Caldwell is facing from a private property dispute to a pattern of conduct case. Different legal weight, different media interest, different kind of problem for a man who has spent 20 years being very careful about what gets connected to his name." The word pattern sat on the table between them. Ellie thought about the 3 families. The renter who had moved without much resistance. The old man whose family had decided for him. All the people who had gone quietly in the dark, who had never met each other, who had never known that what happened to them had happened to others on the same block for the same reasons, by the same machinery, who had never known they weren't alone. "They didn't know," Ellie said. Bear looked at her. "The other families," she said, "they didn't know about each other. That's how it works, right? You keep everyone separate, you deal with them one at a time, and nobody ever adds it up because nobody has enough of the picture." "That's right," Bear said. "So the story puts them in the same room," Ellie said. "Even if they never actually sit down together, the story makes them part of the same thing." Bear looked at her for a moment with that expression, the one where he recalibrated something. "That's exactly what it does," he said. "That's why it matters." Ellie thought about that, about how a piece of paper, a library computer, 2 afternoons, and a librarian who hadn't known what she was helping with had cracked open something that 14 months of pressure and intimidation and men with clipboards had tried to seal shut. She thought about the dollar in her pocket. $1. It was still soft, still slightly creased. The tape residue was still on one corner. She pulled it out and looked at it. Bear watched her. "I want to give this back to you," she said. "Job's not done," he said, the same thing he had said on the porch last night. "I know the job's not done," she said. "But," she stopped, looked for the right words and didn't find the perfect ones, so she used the honest ones instead. "I don't want this to just be a transaction. I don't want to think that's what this was." Bear was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It wasn't." "Then take it back. Not because we're done, because," she looked at the dollar, "because I don't want to be your employer. I want to be something else. Bear looked at the dollar in her palm. Something moved across his face, not the careful authority of the alley, not the controlled steadiness of the street, not even the quiet recognition he'd shown when Ruth had opened her folder. Something older than all of those. Something that had no professional category. He reached out and took the dollar. He folded it once and put it in the front pocket of his vest, over his heart. "Okay," he said. That was all. It was enough. At 2 in the afternoon, Bear's phone rang. He looked at the screen and his jaw set in that specific way, and he took the call in the living room again, and this time his side of the conversation was not mostly silence. His voice was low and controlled, and it moved between questions and statements, and once he said something sharp and short that Ellie could not hear through the wall, but could feel the shape of. He came back into the kitchen 4 minutes later. Everyone who was in the house felt the change in him before he spoke. Not anger, not satisfaction, something precise and focused, the way a tool is focused, built for the exact purpose it's being applied to. "Caldwell made a move," Bear said. Ellie's hands went still. "What kind of move?" Rook said from the doorway. "He called the paper," Bear said. "His lawyers called the paper. They're claiming the documentation Ellie found is misrepresented. They're pushing the editor to pull the story or issue a correction." The kitchen was very quiet. "Can they do that?" Ellie said. "They can try," Bear said, "but Sandra's editor has 30 years in the business, and he has the original county filings in his possession. He told Caldwell's lawyer to document the specific misrepresentation they were claiming." Bear paused. "They couldn't, because there isn't one." Ruth made a sound. Small, private. Not celebration exactly, more like the sound a person makes when they have been holding their breath for a very long time and have finally decided they can stop. "He's scared," Ellie said. "He's exposed," Bear said. "Scared is the symptom. Exposure is the disease." He sat back down. "His lawyer's making that call on the same morning the story goes live, puts his name on a record that connects him to an attempt to suppress it. Sandra is already writing the follow-up." "He made it worse," Tin said from the living room doorway. "He made it significantly worse," Bear agreed. "Men like Caldwell are used to problems going away when they push. When they don't go away, they push harder. And harder creates more evidence, and more evidence is what people like Sandra Holt build careers out of." Ellie set both hands flat on the table. She thought about October, about Hooper on the porch with his smooth voice and his careful threats, about the 16 hours between hearing those voices outside the window and deciding that the Hells Angels were the only option she had left, about the 47 minutes in the alley before she made herself walk toward the bikes, about the 12 seconds between pressing the tape down and turning away, 12 seconds in which she had almost pulled the whole thing back, almost decided it was too much, too far, too strange to work. 12 seconds that had changed everything. "It's going to be okay," she said. She said it quietly, not to anyone in particular, more to the room, to the table and the coffee mugs, in the worn folder, in the morning light, in the creak of the porch that Bear had fixed 2 hours ago, the soft middle board now solid and sound under anyone's foot. Ruth looked at her. "Yes," Ruth said. Just the one word. The way Ruth always used words, exactly as many as were needed and not one more. The men left in the late afternoon. It happened gradually, the way endings happen when they're real rather than scripted. Not all at once, not with ceremony, but in the natural way of people who have finished a thing and are moving toward the next one. Dutch and Garrett went first, back to their bikes, nodding to Ruth at the door with the kind of respect that doesn't need to be performed because it's actual. Tin went next, pausing in the kitchen doorway long enough to say, "Good house," which was addressed partly to Ruth and partly to the house itself. And Ruth said, "Thank you," as if the compliment had been about her, which in a way it had been. Rook lingered. He stood in the living room looking at Ellie with the slightly awkward energy of a 23-year-old who had something to say and wasn't sure how to say it. "You know," he started, "when I found that note on Duke's bike last night, I thought Bear was going to be annoyed." "Was he?" "No," Rook said. "He read it once and he got up and left his pie." He paused. "Bear loves pie. He does not leave pie." Ellie looked at him. "That's the most important detail in this whole story." "I think it might be," Rook said seriously. And then he did laugh. The real kind, unguarded and brief. And he nodded to her once and walked to his bike. Bear was last. He stood on the porch with Ruth and Ellie, the three of them in the early evening light, the street quiet in the way streets get quiet when the thing that was going to happen has already happened, and the neighborhood is still recalibrating. Ruth held out her hand. Bear shook it. Not briefly, the full kind, the kind that holds for a moment and means something. "You fixed my porch board," Ruth said. "Third from the top," Bear said. "Should hold." "It'll hold," Ruth said. "I paid for good wood on that porch 30 years ago." She looked at him with those direct, accurate eyes. "You are welcome at this table any time you are passing through." Bear held her gaze. "Thank you, ma'am." Ruth nodded once, with the particular finality of a woman who has said exactly what she meant and does not need to add to it. And she went back inside and let the screen door close behind her, giving them the moment she understood they needed. Bear looked at Ellie. She was standing on the porch with her arms at her sides and the evening light on her face, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not the terrified 12-year-old from the alley anymore. That girl was still in there. She would always be in there, but she was not the only one present. "You're going to be all right," Bear said. "I know," Ellie said. "I mean longer than this, past this." He was looking at her in the straightforward way he had, the way that did not soften things, but did not harden them either. "Whatever that was in you that made you walk up to those bikes, that doesn't go away. That's not something that happens once." She looked at him. "Is that good?" "It's complicated," he said. "Most useful things are." He reached into his vest pocket, took out the dollar, looked at it once, then held it back out to her. She stared at it. "You said—" "I said the job wasn't done," Bear said. "The job's done now." He kept his hand extended. "Keep it. Not because you paid us, because you should have something that reminds you what you were capable of when you thought you had nothing left." She took the dollar. She held it in both hands and looked down at it. The soft, worn paper, the crease lines, the ghost of the tape. And she thought about the alley, and the 47 minutes, and the 12 seconds, and the thing that had been in her chest that had felt like desperation, but had turned out to be something harder and more durable than that. "Thank you," she said. "You did most of it yourself," Bear said. "Not most of it. More than you know," he said. And then, "Take care of her." He meant Ruth. He meant the house. He meant all of it. "I will," Ellie said. He walked down the porch steps to his bike, swung on. The engine turned over with that sound that was more physical than audible, that low thunder that had rolled through the ground on a morning that felt like a year ago. He looked at her once more from the seat. She raised one hand. He nodded, and then he rode. She stood on the porch and listened to the sound of the bikes until she couldn't hear them anymore, until the thunder faded into ordinary afternoon and the street was just a street again, quiet and unassuming, looking like nothing had happened here, which was exactly the lie that the street had been telling for 14 months while things happened anyway. She looked down at the dollar in her hand one more time. Then she went inside. Ruth was at the table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, the folder closed on the counter behind her, the kitchen looking exactly as it always had, worn and warm, and full of the accumulated weight of a life that had been built here deliberately and defended just as deliberately. Ellie sat down. She wrapped her hands around the mug. Outside, the porch held firm under no one's weight, the third board solid and quiet, The way things are solid and quiet when they have been fixed by someone who understood what they were fixing and why it mattered. Drink your coffee, Ruth said. Ellie drank her coffee. And in the end, that was the whole of it, and the fullness of it. A girl who had walked out of an alley with $1 and the exact right amount of desperation. A woman who had kept records for 32 years because her mother told her to. A man who read a note and left his pie, and a house that stood because every single one of them refused to let it fall.